Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Crypto Convos. I'm your host, MK Lords, and this is a weekly discussion show on crypto-related topics. My first guest is Jeffrey Tucker, who's well known in libertarian circles. He's the Chief Liberty Officer at Liberty.me, a distinguished fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, and he's written several books and articles on libertarianism, Bitcoin, and is single-handedly dismantling the shaving cream industrial complex. So how are you doing today, Mr. Tucker?
Okay, MK, it's really great to see you.
You too. Again, we met for the first time, I believe, in Texas at the Texas Bitcoin conference, but we had some correspondence kind of before that, and we recently saw each other again at Bitcoin in the Beltway and PorcFest. We were in a play together.
Yes, we sort of did that little tour, right? So we did Bitcoin in the Beltway, but then we had a lot of fun actually at PorcFest because we were in a play together. We were in Ayn Rand's January, this night, what's the night of January 16th, something like that, right?
Yeah, night of January 13th, I think. Yeah.
Is it 13th? Yeah, anyway.
Yeah,
so that was really fun because I hadn't read that play before. Had you?
I hadn't. That was my first time reading it, and I actually really started digging into the character I was playing the day before, actually. So it was definitely a fun play, very, very Ayn Rand-esque. So.
It was, and I was very intrigued too because I think that, well, I got interested in the whole theme of the play because it seemed there were certain aspects of it that were unusual, right? A little peculiar, the way it seemed to be celebrating this woman who, wasn't exactly, going about her professional life in the way that is considered to be proper these days, if you know what I mean. But if you consider that it was written in 1933, so this is a period in which, the Great Depression was heavy on. Women had just entered the workforce as, sort of adult professionals in a way. Last hired, first fired. And so that was a kind of a big issue going on in the early years of the 1930s. It's like, how as a woman do you hang on to a job in sort of desperate times? You've already kind of got a ramped up lifestyle in the city. You've got to maintain that standard of living somehow. So women became very resourceful, and that's essentially, I think, what the story is about. So I think if you consider the historical context, it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, I think so too. And it was a play that I found would even be kind of controversial by today's standards. And I really love the strong female characters in the play. And I can only imagine how controversial it must have been back in the 30s when it was written. I mean, and some of the themes in there, the way the characters are written are just so great, and you end up having sympathy for this kind of anti-heroine in it, and it's really lovely, and very strong themes of individualism.
Yeah. Okay. It's funny that you say that about like even today's controversy. I suspect that it's far more controversial today than it was even when it came out, and the reason is at just the times. It was a very common movie trope in the early 30s. Like if you ever watch these Busby Berkeley films, like Gold Diggers of 1933. They're basically about some pretty risque, pretty edgy stuff. That even today we're sort of more squeamish about talking about actually than they were back then. Of course, these movies and this kind of literature comes out before the code. By 1935, 36, you had the government sort of coming in and censoring movies. And suddenly everybody cleaned up their act, But in the early 30s, there's some pretty racy stuff out there.
So I didn't know that was a common trope in the 30s. That's really interesting, though. So that kind of, wow, that gives me a little more clarity into the play, too. So that's really cool.
Well, I began to look it up because the play was so unusual and so intriguing, a little alarming, as you say, a little destabilizing. And of course, you've got all this unusual sort of Randian flavors to it, right? So there's a sort of a consistent stream in her own thinking and her literature. Really, it seems to have lasted her whole life. But at least to my ears, it's an odd mixture of eccentric views, that made sense to her, but I think to the rest of us, can be just seems like an eccentric mix of stuff,
Yeah, coming out of theater, I did theater for several years. The stage directions were very different than a lot of others I had encountered because they were very much written as if it was an Ayn Rand novel. The descriptions of the characters were very, very detailed. It was more than just like, stage direction and blocking and stuff like that. You really got an insight into these characters and the way she described them. And I kind of like that, though. I like the extra expository detail in there. And the philosophy of it's really interesting too. So how has your philosophy kind of changed? What is some of your background? Where did you start philosophically, and how did you make the journey to where you are now as a libertarian?
MK, back I was thinking about this. When I was like in high school, which like a sophomore or junior or something like that, I had first encountered Ayn Rand, and I read her book. Philosophy Who Needs It or something like that, I think, and got sort of briefly enraptured with the whole idea, but then completely forgot about it. Just I like moved on with my life. And then I became an economics major in college, and so then I discovered sort of the ideas of liberty, I guess you could say, through economics, and then it sort of gradually opened up, and it took me, a long time, but eventually plunge into anarchism, and once that happens, there's no turning back. It's the only way you think. I can't lecture and pretend not to be an anarchist. I just am, and that's who I am, and that's the way I think. That's what I live and breathe. It's just this, and that's why my interest in Bitcoin actually sort of extends out of that in a way. I'm most intrigued, I guess, at the fact that this is a kind of a currency and payment system that nobody expected. It was sort of introduced to the world through not any official channel in any way, but just sort of thrown out on a free forum and gradually adopted by market participants when the rest of the world wasn't paying any attention whatsoever. And then we wake up, 3 or 4 years later, and suddenly you've got this full-blown global payment system and a currency that's energized everybody, all over the world, and shows such promise. I find, MK, that when I speak, like, for example, today I had all these students. There were about 100 students I had to speak to. I had 2 hours. I mean, it's really nice, actually. So it's like, you have 2 hours. You can say whatever you want. Okay, so I get to sort of test topics, as I'm going through, I'll sort of organize things a little bit in my mind, but I get to test topics and see what interests people the most. Well, Bitcoin is the most interesting thing that I talked about over the course of 2 days in both 2-hour sessions. I mean, that's what people are most interested in. And I think part of the reason is that it represents a kind of a hope for humanity and a hope for change that doesn't involve kind of top-down political reform that we're never going to get. So that's brilliant. It's really exciting. It's like, oh my God, we can change the world through innovation that extends out of markets and human choice. To realize that is an amazing revelation, because it really adjusts your whole outlook on life, I think.
I agree, and it really is a good example of spontaneous order and kind of this solution for a lot of things, or at least an improvement in a lot of things coming from the ground up directly from the people. Were you a skeptic when you first heard about Bitcoin? What were your thoughts coming from an economics background when you first heard about Bitcoin, and when was that?
Okay, so this must have been probably 2010 when I first started getting articles about it, and yes, I was very skeptical. But I tell you, I didn't entirely rule it out. And the reason I didn't entirely rule out this possibility was that Guido Hülsmann had already, who's an economist in France, had already broken me of my one-time belief that there could be no new money introduced into an economy that could ever replace a national currency. Okay, this is more or less Murray Rothbard's view, that he thought that you had to reform the existing monies. Because there was too much of that people were already using them, and they could never shift to some private alternative like gold or silver or something like that. I mean, he made a very elaborate, detailed argument to this. And I used to believe that it was Guido Hülsmann that convinced me he was not right about this, that we could actually have a private money. Guido always thought it would be gold or silver, But so I didn't entirely rule out the possibility that you could have a money emerge out of the market that would eventually compete with government currencies. the problem, NK, is that I didn't have enough, how do you say it, like technical understanding to really take apart what Bitcoin was all about. Like at that point, open source networks were, distributed networks and also open source programming, and certainly cryptography, you know, this kind of amazing combination of these things, the blockchain. Yeah, I just wasn't prepared to understand it. So it took me, yeah, a couple of years, and then when the light went on, it was burned very bright and very hot.
Yes, yeah, that was kind of my experience with it too. I kind of came from the gold and silver side of things, and I was very skeptical about it at first. I was like, "What do you mean? It exists on the internet and you can't hold it," and stuff like that. And then the kind of technical aspects of it were pretty intimidating for me too. But yeah, the more I learned, like you said, the more my enthusiasm grew for it, and it really fit into a lot of the kind of things I was looking for as far as solutions to maybe some of the social problems and, of course, the economic problems we have. And it seems like there are a lot of anarcho-capitalists involved in this space. How do you see Bitcoin relating to anarcho-capitalism, and do you think it has a place in some of these other hyphenated forms of anarchism?
There's a big debate in the Bitcoin world, as you know, between those people who want to attach to Bitcoin a certain ideological agenda, like it is anarchism, it is inseparable from anarchism. It entered into an anarchist space, and it always will live within that space. And then there's other people who want to kind of have a very much more mainstream, message. This is a better payment system than credit cards and PayPal. This is a tool of financial inclusion for those people who are currently excluded. And I guess my feeling about so this is what's really great, MK. I'm sure you've thought about this too. The great thing, the really great thing about Bitcoin is that it doesn't really care what we say about it. you know, like whatever our views are towards what Bitcoin is and what it does and its future. I mean, it's going to take its own course, regardless. So I'm happy for all comers, all points of view.
And that's something that I found really intriguing about it, because I had really started to study panarchy probably a couple of years ago, which you're probably familiar with. And it does allow for that freedom to choose your own system to live under. And I view Bitcoin and some of these other cryptocurrencies as ways for people to kind of create their own spaces and their own ideals and have these competing systems. Maybe someone wants a constitutional republic of some kind, or some kind of democracy based on voting. And well, you can do that through the blockchain. So I think that's really interesting, voluntary forms of government. And I think you're seeing you see so much variety in the anarchism space, and even on Liberty.me, which is something you started. I recently joined the community. I found it to be really friendly, really inclusive, very open to other ideologies, and I found that really refreshing. So what gave you the idea to start Liberty.me? And where do you kind of see it go? What are your goals for it?
Well, what gave me the idea was the sense that the internet is our new frontier. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, everything before 1995 is the dark ages. We didn't know anything. We couldn't access anything. We couldn't talk to anybody. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible life. And the opening of the digital realm was the beginning of a new form of freedom. But what I felt was needed desperately was a full-scale immersion. Like I really wanted to create this city. Like a full-blown city. We're using every kind of tool of communication possible as a scalable forum that could grow vertically and horizontally, infinitely, thanks to virtualization and some of the open source tools that are available now. And I just thought, well, we have to do this. I mean, this is our new world. This is the real free world. So we have to act on it. And Bitcoin to some extent inspired this. I mean, I wanted to become like a builder of liberty, not just a person who just sat around dreaming of it. So that's where Liberty.me came from. We pushed very, very hard. I mean, it was last spring I just started thinking about it, but we're not even a year into when we started actually hammering away on the real business model and stuff like that. So, and we've only been open 90 days now. We've already got thousands of members. and our traffic is just great. I mean, it's soared up, and I just was looking at some of the public rankings today. We've risen 500,000 points in the last 30 days, in traffic. It's great. I'm very pleased. I always believed, MK, that if we could combine these three things, technology, crowdsourced information, and commerce, into a really nice mixture on a digital space, it would become combustible. That's what I always believed. It's kind of an act of faith, really, more than anything else.
Well, it seems like it's been really successful so far, and it's actually I find myself it's hard for me to keep up with all the great content that's constantly coming out there. So, and that's a good thing. I think I like there to be almost too much information to go through, if that makes sense. And you've done a really good job at getting Bitcoin out to other audiences too. You were on Glenn Beck. I think that was really well received by a lot of people, and I was actually kind of surprised because I've never been the biggest fan of Glenn Beck, and I saw him kind of talking about Bitcoin, and I was a bit skeptical at first. I'm not even gonna lie, but when he started talking about, he was telling his kids to invest in Bitcoin. This kind of like light went off. I was like, did I just really hear that? That was so crazy to me. That here's this guy, this pundit who, it was really against a lot of these other, ideas and philosophies that I support, but he was very open to Bitcoin. And what kind of techniques do you like to use to speak to people about Bitcoin? What has been, in your experience, some of the most productive ways to kind of bring Bitcoin to different audiences, like someone that would watch Glenn Beck, from the right?
Okay, so there are a number of things that I've kind of jumped on. One is I like to, but let me just mention like three things I like to talk about. One is to emphasize that until Bitcoin, money was basically a socialistically owned nationalized commodity, controlled, produced, managed by the government in combination with the central banks. And anytime you're gonna, if you put government in charge of shoes, we'd all be wearing shoes that were like 1913 style shoes, right? I mean, like, they ruin everything they touch, and that's basically what's happened to money. We've not seen any improvement. In fact, the money's gotten much, much worse because we didn't have the forces of market competition and entrepreneurship brought to the task. So money has not been brought into the 21st century. And national monies have not, and will not. They're ever more old-fashioned. So that's one point I make. The other one that I'd like to talk about is how this government sort of cartelized system of nationalized money has been so exclusionary, to so many people, not just in the developing world, but even in the United States. I mean, if you can't get a bank account and you can't get a credit card, then you're really out. I mean, it's not possible for your talents and skills to be used as part of the division of labor in the global digitalized economy. I mean, it's an exclusionary style system. So I like to think about that and talk about that subject a lot, because I think it's really important. I mean, you look at like the Bill Gates Foundation for more than 10 years has had a special project on how to deal with financial exclusion around the world. Okay, so I mean, Bitcoin is the answer. It's the answer to this problem. So I think that's really important. And let's see, what's another thing I like to talk about? So I don't usually talk about the political implications about Bitcoin until people are really ready for it. Sometimes you can talk about Bitcoin and people begin to realize, oh my God, this is actually going to take money away from the government. And once that happens, the whole world's going to change. I really believe that, So, but I tend to wait a little bit to talk about that. The other thing, MK, that I like to really discuss with people, only because people don't know about it, I like to talk about its history. And the reason is that most people just got interested in Bitcoin in like 2013, and they have this impression that somehow this weird little digital thing is some sort of high-flying, financial racket or something. It's like a bubble. Like, why is anybody valuing this thing that doesn't even exist? It's like they don't understand where it came from. So I like to go back to 2008 and talk about the white paper, and then talk about the Genesis block and the 10 months that went by when Bitcoin has zero value, and then the slow crawl towards valuation, and why that happened. Not because of a Ponzi scheme or some sort of frenzy. Is because people were testing the network to see if it worked, and once it became obvious that the blockchain solved so many of our problems, then the monetary unit attached to that blockchain began to obtain value. So I like to tell that story because I think it turns lights on.
Yeah, and that's something I like to talk about too, because I get the question all the time when I talk about Bitcoin, well, what gives it value? And there are a lot of different ways you can answer that question, but for me, it's the efficiency of the payment system. And you mentioned the unbanked too. I got into Bitcoin because I saw that it was useful from a philanthropy and charity aspect. I had found out about Jason King and Sean's Outpost shortly after I jumped into Bitcoin, and that's really what kind of solidified it for me. Even before I kind of had the technical understanding of it, was its potential. And I still tell people, when they're getting into it, put your whole life savings into it. Be skeptical about it. Read the white paper though, and do your own research into it. But for me, it's very much the potential that blockchain technology has, and Bitcoin, not even as a currency, but as all of these other things. As a lot of Bitcoiners like to say, currency is just the first app of Bitcoin. So there's so much potential for it. But of course, whenever you have a lot of progress that doesn't come, from the centralized top down, you see a lot of people trying to stop that. And of course, it's really harmful for people who are already struggling in the economic situation that some of these same people have caused. So what are your views on these recent regulations that have been proposed by Ben Losky in New York?
Well, I mean, they're absolutely grim. It's an attempt to abolish Bitcoin by regulating it out of existence. I think they know that this is what's really going on here. And it's really calamity. I don't expect them to go through. Do you? I'm not sure. I just don't. I have a hard time believing it. But the thing about governments and technology is that they can always do things to slow down the technology, but they can't get rid of it. That's the key thing. I mean, governments can either, adopt a laissez-faire attitude and let the future get here sooner, in which case the society will be much better off, or they can just slow it down with idiotic regulations and just prolong the pain. But eventually, whether it's 5, 10, 15, 20 years, cryptocurrency is going to be a serious challenger to national monies, and there's nothing any regulator is going to be doing about that. They can only cause damage at this point.
And they seem so unnecessarily draconian. I mean, they're putting regulations on Bitcoin exchanges that other banks and financial service industries don't have to go through. It's really insane. And what I think it kind of is a way to kind of make this big scary push, to say, hey, look at what we're going to do to you. And I think they're probably going to come back in a little bit and kind of scale it down. And then kind of be like, look, we fixed it for you. We got rid of the really scary parts of the regulation, so you're going to be more likely to get involved in it. But I still maintain that resistance is probably the best measure to take if you're wanting to run an exchange. Get out of New York. I mean, in New York City, there's so much regulation there, and I mean, they don't want business to succeed. I mean, if it's not funding the people who are already making money off of others. If it's not funding Wall Street, you're obviously going to have some problems. So what are your kind of views on that? Because a lot of people are focused on the government regulation of things, and I think in some ways they might forget that this doesn't just hurt the government. This hurts some of these Wall Streeters and some of these private banking interests. And of course, there's a lot of collusion with that, but do you think that in a way that people might be forgetting about that as they focus on the regulators so much?
So right now, it's very interesting. This sort of this financial establishment is just now getting serious about Bitcoin. They're just now starting to look into it and consider its use for B2B transactions and that sort of thing. And once people discover this and begin to test it out, it's going to be just crazy. It's going to be sheer madness. We're going to see a real network effect take place. There's going to be a tipping point that takes place within corporate finance towards Bitcoin. And when that happens, I don't think any regulator is going to be able to control it really. And in the end, MK, what's interesting about all this stuff is that the other thing they can really control is the aspect of the Bitcoin economy that is coming and going from national currency to Bitcoin. But once you live in the Bitcoin ecosphere, it really is a free land, and there's no regulator that can really stop what you're doing. Like I say, they can cause damage to retail establishments and that sort of thing, but The other thing is they can easily drive business out of the country. I talked to my friend from Coinapult yesterday. They have a really new, I don't know if you saw that interview, but they have a new technology called locks, right? So it sort of stabilizes the price. And they just will not touch U.S. clientele. And not because existing regulations prevent it, but they just have this weird fear that something's going very wrong in the United States. There's so-called regime uncertainty, like nobody knows what's going to happen next. So he's like, I'm just going to stay out of there. We're not going to get heavily invested, a big client base in the U.S., only to have the regulators come in and make life hell.
Right, right. And you're seeing that with a lot of exchanges. They're going out of the country to do their business. And I think that's going to continue to happen if the U.S. takes a firm stance against Bitcoin. It looks like we have a good question from Dan Darden. Will enough people ignore or bypass the regulation to make it irrelevant?
Yeah, I think this is what's going to happen, really. Like, all you got to do is create gray markets. Like we talked about earlier, they thought they'd ban marijuana and alcohol and file sharing and the Silk Road and online pharmaceuticals. I mean, the list of things that governments tried to ban that are ubiquitous today is really very long. So we can just add Bitcoin to that list.
Yeah, I think, yeah, the things that they're trying to prevent with these regulations, they're just going to end up causing more of on black markets. I mean, they're saying it's in, this kind of idea of, oh, we're protecting you, and it's for your own safety kind of thing. No, they don't care about your safety. It has nothing to do with that, and they don't really care about, they don't really seem to care about justice either. I mean, none of these bankers went to jail for crashing the economy. So, I mean, I don't hold out much hope that this is in the interests of the consumer.
What's interesting about this, MK, it's a little bit like gun control and all the rest of the stuff. It turns out, they want to crack down on money laundering and criminality, right? But the only people who comply with these regulations are those people who are trying to be legitimate businesses. I mean, they're the people that are trying to obey the law and not be bad actors and not do bad things. If you're gonna be Breaking Bad, I don't care what the laws are. You're gonna be Breaking Bad. It doesn't matter what the regulators say.
Exactly.
So they end up regulating people who don't. They're protecting us from problems that are not problems among those people who comply. The real problems from their point of view, I don't think it's a problem, but from their point of view, exist in sectors that don't care what the regulations are.
Yes, you're always going to have black markets. You're always going to have criminal activity. And I mean, I'm not an anarchist because I believe the anarchist philosophy will solve these problems necessarily. I think it will, kind of lessen the amount of violence coming from government, which tends to do the most violence over the greatest amounts of areas. But yeah, you're always going to have that criminal element, and yes, you should try to stop it as much as possible. But regulations are not the answer. It doesn't work, from this kind of top down. It usually works better from a community-based approach. It's self-policing communities. In the case of gun control, communities protecting their own neighborhoods. So I kind of would like to see some of that with Bitcoin. It is kind of difficult. A lot of people are saying, oh, well, maybe we have to self-police, to show the regulators that we don't need them, kind of thing. I think ignoring them is probably a good approach. You can only ignore them for so long if you're really wanting to do business, though, as an exchange.
Right, and the other thing is that there really isn't a we in the Bitcoin space. I mean, there is a foundation that represents Bitcoiners. We can have these conferences. We can have Bitcoin and Beltway. I just got back from Chicago. You can put them all together in a room and have it, but really, in the end, there is no Bitcoin establishment, and it's a tool and a technology that belongs to the whole world, and it's going to take that course of action that represents a kind of consensus of the market, really, and none of us have control that. So. Yeah, and that's a wonderful thing about it. I mean, one of the reasons I love Bitcoin is that I feel like any mistakes I make in judgment or misstatements I have or any wishes I have for it, or really in the end have no effect on Bitcoin. It's going to go its own way with or without me. And I rather like that. I like being this kind of observer. And it is fun to observe, isn't it? Like every single day there's some great news coming out. It's really great every day.
I really like being involved in Bitcoin because there's a lot more good news every day than there is bad news. And with all of the other, especially given the world events that are going on right now, it's nice to kind of be in this space and have some kind of reassurance that not everything's falling apart, at least, in Bitcoin. But it looks like we have a few more questions here. So this is a good one from Alex Hutchins. Let's see. He is asking, or she's asking, what were the compliance statistics with the gold confiscation event, and why should we expect different compliance reaction if such action was taken towards Bitcoin?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I've studied that gold confiscation of 1933, I think it was.
Yeah.
And I know there were many people that were put in jail, other people who, coughed up, all kind of jewelry that wasn't even being collected by FDR. He wasn't asking you to turn in your gold jewelry, but people would send it to the White House in any case. I've always had the impression that it was very successful. But the questioner makes a really good point. We actually don't know, do we? I mean, how many people didn't actually comply with that rule? I don't know the answer to that. But now that I think about it, it's preposterous to think that everybody would have gone along with that. I mean, you'd have to be an idiot, really.
And I would think they had less, I guess, less of a way to enforce it. I mean, other than I don't know if they were, going door to door confiscating, but some people did actually hold out. And I want to say a couple in California discovered some gold that was like buried that may have been hidden by a family member during the gold confiscation. I
Mm.
want to say I heard a story similar to that. I may have some of the details wrong with that, but I want to say there was probably quite a bit of resistance because people were able to see what was happening to their money immediately. And, they had enough of an understanding to, keep gold, and then the government tried to take away the kind of the only thing that was protecting them financially in a lot of ways.
And,
So I'm sure there was some resistance.
and doing it in the name of saving the economy. That's the great thing, that sort of Keynesian theory of the time. This is, I guess, before Keynes's book came out, but the whole New Deal was premised on this idea that what seems to be bad for you is really good for society, and what's good for you is probably bad for society. I mean, right? That was the whole theory of that decade. That there's this disharmony between your interests and the interests of everybody else.
It
Crazy.
was, yeah, the kind of great society ideals. We have another good question from Alex Hutchins. Can you outline the dispute about Bitcoin not being compatible with the regression theorem?
I can very quickly. I mean, I thought about this for like a year. I couldn't solve it in my own mind. I finally decided whether I could solve it or not. Bitcoin is a real currency, so it doesn't even matter. Maybe the regression theorem is wrong, but actually, there's a very simple answer to the whole thing, and that is that it comes from looking at the history. The regression theorem argues that a money has to have some sort of pre-existing economic value before it can become a money. Has to exist in some as a commodity or something. I think the answer is that the blockchain really is the commodity valuation that leads to the monetization of Bitcoin. That's just simple. I mean, Bitcoin had zero value at all before the blockchain was tested and tested and tested again over the course of 10 months. And once that blockchain, the payment system, in other words, once it became very obvious that this is an extremely valuable service, then the money, the monetary unit that was attached to that payment system began to obtain value. In other words, I think it conforms exactly according to the Mises theory of money's origins.
All right, and I want to say Bob Murphy has written a bit on this, so you may want to check out some of his work, Alex. I think he has some pretty good.
Bob finally concluded. Excuse me one second. Bob finally concluded that he couldn't quite make sense of it, but that if anything was wrong, it was not Bitcoin, it was the regression theorem. But in the meantime, he and I have talked about this a lot. I think it is fully reconcilable. But I think there's a lesson here, really. We should not let our theories of the world blind us to the reality outside the window. We need to become better students of reality.
Right, and my background isn't necessarily in economics. I did kind of independently study it for a while, and that's really what brought me around to libertarianism in a lot of ways, was just kind of understanding how markets work. And that's an argument that I kind of use when people bring up some of these other economic arguments. It's like, well, it's usable. It's something that people have value. Or that people think has value to them. And I don't know that these older economic theories, before the age of the internet, are even really applicable in this case, because there's been so much technological advancement since that time that I don't think any of these economists could have predicted where things would go philosophically, technologically, especially in terms of currency.
I think that's right. I mean, if you read Hayek's 1974 book called Denationalization Money, it comes closer to any other book that I've ever seen to kind of foreshadowing Bitcoin. But, Hayek himself never imagined such a thing as a digital good. His speculations about future monies emerging from private markets were all connected to commodity markets and indexes and those sorts of things, price indices growing out of commodity markets and things. He never imagined such a thing as a digital age, really. So it really, at some level, it doesn't really matter. I agree with you on that. I do think we need to get better at, like I say, look outside the window, seeing the beautiful things that are happening around us, getting humble intellectually enough to be able to learn from what the market is teaching us.
I agree. Yeah. Dan Darden has another question. So this is interesting. What do you think of digital tokens being issued on top of the blockchain? For example, the LTB coin offered from letstalkbitcoin.com. This is one project under fire from regulation, as anyone can send the token to someone in New York.
Yeah, these are so-called colored coins. Is that your understanding? Is that what they're called? We're not talking about all coins. These are really branded.
No, this is on top of the blockchain. So LTB coin is pretty interesting. It's also a way. I was talking to Andreas Antonopoulos a little bit about this, and he was kind of explaining how, in a way, it's proof of publishing. So and there's some other functions to it too. I believe I need to look more into it. But yeah, this is going to be issued on top of the blockchain.
I think it's so exciting to see this kind of experimentation and where it's all going to lead. I mean, that's part of the fun of being part of a market, We get to be surprised by beautiful, exciting things that we didn't anticipate. So, none of us knows if Bitcoin is going to be the ultimate, final winner in the struggle. In fact, there will not be a final winner. The process will continue on. It could be anything.
Yeah, and I think with this regulation, it could target that, because right now, like Dan's saying, this token can be sent, but the way the regulation is written right now, I mean, it would even prevent Bitcoin from being created in the first place. Some of the facets of this regulation, they're banning you from creating other currencies, cryptocurrencies. So.
Yeah, this is crazy. This is crazy stuff. For so long now, I would say for probably 40 years, the government has just been such an obvious and overwhelming conspiracy against all forms of progress. That seems to be their main job that they believe they're responsible for. It's just stopping people from having cool lives.
That's true. So we have one from Freedom Pieces. Do you think, let me select it first, make sure. Do you think the U.S. will suddenly shift and turn very Bitcoin friendly once it realizes the yuan or other currencies will overtake the U.S. dollar, just like it happened when the U.S. dollar overtook the British pound? UK is pretty friendly to Bitcoin now.
Yeah, I don't know. The OECD had a study that came out about 3 weeks ago when they said that Bitcoin would never replace national monies under any circumstances, because national monies will always be valued for purposes of paying your taxes. I mean, is that really the world we're looking at in the future? Where the only reason you want dollars is so you have to pay the tax man? I mean, that's pretty cool. I mean, that would be an amazing world where cryptocurrency is used for all existing transactions, with the exception of paying your taxes, and that's all national monies would be used for. That's pretty extraordinary. I'd say that's a pretty optimistic scenario.
Yeah, we'll definitely see, because it's there are other countries who have tried to back away from using the petrodollar, and it hasn't worked out so well for them. But this isn't gold, this isn't silver, this is something that's entirely uncharted territory. So hopefully the U.S. wises up, and they'll be more Bitcoin friendly and maybe back off. But they're
I,
also not known for backing off.
right. One quick point, as long as we're talking about these theoretical aspects, this should be obvious to anybody who studied Bitcoin that it's vastly superior to any gold standard that you could ever have. Because the only way to transport value on a geographically non-contiguous basis under a gold standard is through money substitutes. And money substitutes require third parties, meaning banks, and that's the beginning of all corruption, right? So Bitcoin is weightless and it takes no space, and you can transport value peer-to-peer anywhere in the world. You can't do that with gold. You can't do that with silver. And it does this, achieves this miracle without third-party trust agencies. So Bitcoin just gets ever more cool the more you think about it.
And I think you actually just gave a great answer to what was going to be my last question. So we can go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you so much again for joining me. This has really been a great discussion. And if people want to find you, where can they find you and the rest of your awesome work?
Yeah, go over to liberty.me, join us. We have a 30-day free trial running right now. Jump in there, be part of the conversation, part of the discussion. We have actually 3 guides on Bitcoin right now. All 3 are like really, really good and solid and reputable and trustworthy. And you can just download those, keep them for free. If you want to hang around, then it's $9 a month after that. I think you probably will hang around because it's a pretty cool place. But, love for you to look at my writings there too. I have my own URL, tucker.liberty.me. And MK, thank you so much for your amazing work. And
Yes. Oh, it looks like you a little bit. Okay, you cut out there at the very end. Can you still hear me?
yeah, I can hear you. Thank you again for having me. It's been lovely.
Got me. It's really fun. It's a very cool community. Lots of good conversations going on there. Lots of good lectures. I've really been enjoying it so far. And check us out next week. I will be back doing Crypto Convos. Our guest will be Will Pengman of Topeki. I'm sorry, I mispronounced that. Topeki and Bitcoin Milwaukee. So we will catch you next week. And until then, keep calm and encrypt all the things. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.